Hello and welcome to our third edition of Groovecast, the podcast for the rhythm section. This week we're going to be talking about a bit of a different subject. We're going to be changing tact here, and we're going to be talking a little bit about gear, aren't we, Charlie?
We certainly are. So, I think it's something that a lot of musicians, and especially us who do it for a living, are very picky about, or at least considerate about, of our sound, and to an extent how we look on stage, if it's and what gear we need to get us the work that we want to do. I think is a key part of the job, if you like.
Yeah, and we're going to be covering a few different subjects to do with gear. But I thought it would be a nice way to ease in, to talk a little bit about our own sort of ideal instrument and what we look for when we go to a drum shop in your case, or a guitar shop, or what you're looking for in it. And so, what do you look for in your drums?
Yes, so I mean, for me, it's all about sound. Fundamentally, it's got to sound good. Whatever I'm looking for, whether it's a snare drum, cymbals, anything like that, it's got to sound good. That's the root of everything that I do as a musician. And for me, that would be, even if it's, whether it's vintage or modern or new or whatever, the sound's got to be right. So if I'm looking at, say for example, a snare drum, if there's 3 identical snare drums, say, they're all from different vintages. You might have a 60s aluminium snare, a 70s aluminium snare, and an 80s aluminium snare, just out of comparison's sake. If the 60s one sounds the best, that would be the one I'll buy, even if it's the most beaten up looking, old looking, whatever. That would be the one I would go for, even if they say, the 80s one's pristine. If it doesn't sound as good as the 60s one, I ain't interested. So that's kind of what I would definitely go for. I love a bit of a little bit of aging if it is a vintage piece, a bit of character on there. But you want something that's going to give you a variety of sounds as a drummer. So whether it's, you can change something with the different heads or different tuning, dampening, or any of that, or just in the way that you play a certain drum can change the way that it would sound. So you want for me, it's something I want with a great sound, but also really, really versatile, and that's something that can give me a lot of options. What about yourself with the old bass?
The old bass, the old plank of wood. Yeah, I'd say that's versatility, certainly key for me in terms of the layout of it, or the make, and what goes into it. I'm pretty particular in maple necks. I like, in basses, you're paying for the wood, really, and the material that goes towards it. If you're going to buy a starter bass for £100 or £70 or something, it's not going to last you, whereas you buy a really nice maple neck Fender Jazz, it's going to last you your life, really. Maybe it might need a bit of setting up again or something later down the line, but I'd say, yeah, for me, it's kind of always been Fender has been the benchmark. I mean, there's a lot of other great makes. Squire do great sort of Fender, more affordable types, but the Fender Jazz bass is one of the most versatile basses, and I'm lucky enough to have one. And even though it might not be my favourite bass to use right now, if I'm doing a gig and you don't know what is required, if it's going to be 5-string or not, my Fender Jazz bass is a 5-string. You just know you're going to be solid with it. You can do the Motown. You can mine. You can set to the front or back pickup with the back pickup provides a bit more of that Jacko tone and a funky thing. And then if you set it to the front pickup, it gives it that more gritty Motown James Jamerson style. So certainly Fender, and but the wood is kind of what I look for first and foremost. And I don't have that many instruments. I'm not sure if you can see on the video behind me that don't have wooden necks, and mostly maple necks with a few exceptions. So that's kind of what I look for in a bass. And I think you did mention there the vintage gear, and I think that's another topic we were thinking about talking about, because there's a bit of controversy over the vintage and modern thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I think definitely the way that the industry has gone over the past couple of years, that a lot of brands now are going for the vintage modern stuff. So they're bringing back a vintage recipe, but with a modern edge, if you like. So it's doing a classic, but with maybe updating some of the fixtures and fittings or whatever. So I mean, personally for me, I tend to go for those sort of vintage sounds, and 9 times out of 10, if I want a vintage sound, I'll use a vintage bit of kit. I think that's just that there's something for me that some of the more modern vintage stuff just doesn't have, and I think it's the age. I think definitely especially in drum shells, wood ages, and same with cymbals. They age and mature over time, and I mean, with a bit of TLC, sometimes you can easily make a lot of vintage equipment more than giggable and more than roadworthy. That you don't feel afraid to take it out in case, or it's a bit fiddly to change a string or whatever. I mean, my working snare at the moment is a 1963 Ludwig. It just works. I've done very little to it since I bought it, but it just sounds great. It looks fine. It works perfectly, and it's really, really, really dependable. And so it just tends to be the drum I go for. But looking at all the drum brands, particularly been doing this lately, and I'm sure the same has been happening with basses, that you get people like Gretsch have been putting the Broadcaster line out, which is their reinterpretation of what they were doing in the 50s, and same with Ludwig's Legacy, which is what they were doing in the 60s, and all of that. And I get why they're doing it, because it does make that vintage look and sound as close as you can get from a modern shell or a modern kit. But I think it just lacks some of the character and some of the almost the originality that the real McCoy has. And I don't know how it is with basses. Feel free to enlighten me.
Well, it's kind of funny because again, talking with you a few weeks back, and you have actually brought this up, the whole vintage versus modern thing, and I wasn't really aware of. I mean, I knew of it, but I didn't know it was a massive thing of making modern basses seem vintage by relicking them and sort of and trying to make them seem like 60s bass and stuff. From my point of view, it's I've always just tried to get the best gear that I can, and certainly with Fenders, it's with electric basses and Fenders, you kind of got a clear line of what that is and what you're getting out of it. So I can understand the vintage thing, and like you say, in those days it was just a different. The material they used, especially, it was, you could have a bass that would last you forever. Whereas the difference now with making the modern stuff seem vintage is the materials just aren't really the same. And certainly in guitars and inside the nuts and the washers they use and stuff, they just aren't really. They're not made of the same material, certainly, and they're not made to last as long because, unfortunately, they do want you to spend more money later down the line to repair stuff.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you can't get gear that's going to last you forever. It just means you might have to spend more to get it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's what they call planned obsolescence, I think. They make things to last a while, but not a lifetime. I mean, it's the same with if you look at an iPhone. It's like you buy a brand new iPhone, and that'll be brand new until they release another one in about 6 months' time.
Yeah,
and that's what they rely on to keep business. Because otherwise, we'd still all be using exactly what we had 10 years ago.
Yeah. But in terms of the vintage thing, I'm definitely not adverse to that, and because I think the first proper bass I had was a Fender P bass, and it. I know one of the other things we were thinking about covering was the collectors thing as well, and people who sort of just buy gear to collect it, which I'm sure we'll cover later. But this is a bass that was owned by a collector, and was never played. It was pre-owned and sold as a pre-owned bass, but it was never actually played. They just bought it and stuck it in a cabinet for a couple of years. So it was virtually new, and it's a vintage bass. I think it's a 64 or something. It's a James Jamerson bass, and it's great. And that vintage sound, I've got a Hofner bass, and you can't beat that vintage sound, especially for those gigs. Quite a few of the gigs I'm doing at the moment require that Motown gritty sound. And like I said, the jazz bass can do that, but if you have a P bass and you know that's most of what you're going to be playing, then you can't beat that sound. And I play with people and they don't usually notice, if you have a new bass or your sound really, and they know that they like it, but they don't know the specifics behind it. But the people that I play with at the moment, when I brought in my sort of James Jamerson bass, they thought it was brilliant. So
yeah, well, that's what you want, and I think I don't know if you feel the same, but when you sometimes are playing that instrument that's maybe period correct or accurate to the sound, it makes you play differently. Definitely, you kind of get into that headspace a lot more because it feels natural to play probably how you're playing. If I'm playing on a jazz kit, say an old Slingerland jazz kit, for example, I'll probably play it a little bit differently and feel a little bit differently to how I would play on a modern rock and roll kit. It's just a different vibe, and kind of I think it definitely, for me anyway, it has a generally a positive effect on your sound and your touch almost on the instrument.
Yeah, it's funny because James Jamerson had a thing where he would. I think it was partly to do with the fact that he played upright bass as well, but he would only use his first finger to pluck the strings. He wouldn't use two fingers, which is something I've been taught to use two fingers, obviously, and to make it more proficient. But when we're playing that Motown stuff, and if I am playing my Fender P bass, I tend to try and use one finger just because it does make a difference to the sound. And like you say, playing it differently, it does actually make a difference to the sound and make it more the sound of that time.
Yeah, and I think it's to one extent how you play is more important than what you play as far as instruments, because I think that has a much more a much greater inference of the sound that you're getting is through the technique or the way that you're putting that through whatever instrument it might be. So if you play, I don't know, if you're playing one fingered on a Squier starter bass, it'll still sound Motowny, because you're putting that kind of technique through it. So whether it sounds as good as a P bass or whatever is irrelevant. It'll still have that almost correct vibe coming through, that you're playing it almost the way that it was done originally.
Yeah, and from the other point of view, the sort of more modern gear, because I mean, I wouldn't class myself as a gearhead in any way, shape, or form, but I know what I like in a bass, like I said, and I mean, since I've kind of been into the Wolfpack thing and Snarky Puppy and that funky stuff, I've just, and also Marcus Miller and the slap side of things, I've always wanted a Music Man Stingray, and again, a couple of years ago I was lucky enough to get one from One Joe Bass in London. If you're ever down there, it's always worth a visit.
Cheeky advert.
But yeah, so but I was lucky enough to get one of those. And in terms of the modern sound, again, it's not as versatile as the Fender Jazz Bass, so I wouldn't be able to use it on every gig. But and it's actually being repaired as we speak. But if it was available to me now, I would certainly be playing it. And in terms of, it's kind of strange. The Fender Jazz Bass is great, and I love playing it. But as soon as I got that Music Man, it just felt right when I got it in the shop. And I played it a few times before I had to get it repaired, and before the pandemic, obviously, it was kind of needing repairing at the start of the first lockdown, to be honest. So, but I managed to get it out for a couple of gigs, and it was almost like it enhanced my playing. I think you have to be it doesn't matter if you have great gear, you have to obviously be a good musician playing it. But it did almost feel, it gave me more confidence to fly up the neck and just have a go at stuff that I wouldn't usually do, and I just try and keep it solid. But no, so from the modern point of view, that's kind of the modern gear that I have. And I mean, it's kind of not a great example of the materials because it has been needing fixing for a while. But other than, I think it was just a wiring issue. But other than that, it's a great piece of kit. And if you sort of have the money and you are able to get a Music Man, I think they are a wonderful bass. And if you're into that funky stuff as well, it's perfect for all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, let's just bring it on to, since we're now talking about some more of the modern stuff, the whole idea of relicking, which I know is something we've discussed in the past, and it's definitely something that's gotten really popular with guitars, and I don't think it's really hit the drum market, and I can understand why. But what do you think in terms of, would you buy, or would you want to buy a brand new instrument off the shelf that looks 40 years old?
Well, it like I said before, it really matters on how it would sound like if I was playing. I mean, it's not the type of thing I'm not looking for a bass in general anyway, so it's hard to sort of say that I definitely wouldn't. But I mean, if it was just me, I would just, if I really wanted a worn bass or a worn 60s bass, and I wanted it to be worn, I would probably just buy a used 60s bass. But or alternatively, just get your own gear and get some stories in it yourself. And you know, you're gonna get dings and get scratches on your gear yourself. And as much as it pains me when I look at some of the scratches I have on my basses, I know that there's something behind it, and I know where I did it as well. But it's kind of interesting because I really didn't know much about that until you enlightened me on it a while ago. And yeah, I don't really, it's not something I think I would go into a shop trying to buy a bass that's new that looks kind of old.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like, I mean, I think for you, back from what you were saying, you definitely wouldn't. It wouldn't be something you'd look for. But if the bass sounded right, it wouldn't put you off it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's and for me, it's, I mean, as I say, it's not really been a thing in the drum world as far as relicking. I mean, and I do understand it, because if you're going to go out and buy a brand new shiny drum kit, you want a brand new shiny drum kit. You don't want one that looks like someone's thrown a load of stuff at it and, you know, dragged it behind a truck or whatever. Because you think, well, you know, the minute you take that out of the house and say, oh, look at my brand new drum kit, everyone will go, what the heck have you done to it? You know, what have you done to it since you've just bought it, because it looks a state? And I mean, I can understand that it can give a vibe and all that, and I know a lot of people go for that image thing. But for me, if you want a vintage sounding, vintage looking bit of gear, buy vintage. You know, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a better quality of product, because as we said, the materials back then were of, you know, and the manufacturing was superior to probably how it is now, when things were done by hand, or, you know, and a lot of care was taken into making them, rather than just a production line where they were just flying off the end at 20 to the minute. I think for me that's where I'm at. It's like if I want that sound, if I want vintage cymbals, if I want vintage sounding snares or whatever, I'll just buy vintage instruments. I'll buy what's appropriate, and I have done. I mean, most of my cymbal collection has come to me either used or vintage, because I like that patina. I like it to have a bit of age, a bit of character, and nothing else for me sounds as good if it's just come off the production line and they've put a patina on it in the factory, because there's a difference between doing that and having a cymbal that's actually seen 55 years of use, and being in and out of cases, in and out of sweaty jazz clubs or wherever. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it certainly does. And yeah, it's just sort of a funny thing to me, especially like you said, buying sort of a gear that's been worn, and then you almost feel like it isn't new because it has been battered, and that is certainly part of it. Although if it sounded good, it wouldn't 100% put me off. I do like the gear to look somewhat decent before I've put some scratches in it myself. Yeah, it's just an interesting thing, and it's going to be interesting seeing how that progresses. And I think I'd imagine the people that are going to buy that gear are probably going to be collectors, maybe, who want to have a drum or something they feel has been gigged by somebody great, or a bass that they feel has been gigged by whoever, James Jamerson or Paul McCartney. Speaking of which, I know that you were thinking of covering the whole collectors and players and the differences between that, and what
it's. I mean, I think the difference between them, the lines there are very, very blurred. You can't really just say categorically so and so is a collector or so and so is a player, because a lot of it, you've got players who've got mountains of stuff. I mean, someone like Jeremy Stacey springs to mind as a drummer who's got a lot of equipment but uses it and is always seeking whatever new sound that suits whatever he's working on, or whoever he's working for, and that I totally understand. But then you'll have those who buy the pristine stuff, who want one of every colour that they did in 1962, or one of every style that they made, or the catalogue shots or whatever. And I think for me, collectors tend to want the pristine stuff. They tend to want it's never been out of the case, it's sat under a bed for 45 years and never seen the light of day. That's very much a collector's item. Whereas definitely in what they call player grade gear, which is probably more where we look if we're looking for something of a certain vintage, if it's got a few bumps or scratches on it, doesn't really matter, because it just shows that it's been loved and used by whoever was owning it previously, and it's had its life and it's still got what we want in there. And I mean, I think the other thing with being a player is that constant change is something that we don't mind. If you decide in 5 or 10 years that you're going to sell a certain bass and buy something different because that's what the fashion of the day is, that's fair enough. Whereas a collector would probably hang on to it and somehow, just add another bass to the collection, rather than saying, right, I'm getting something new in, something that I'm not using can go elsewhere and be used by someone else. And I think that's definitely a mindset that players have that collectors don't, where we don't mind letting go of things, even if it's valuable, rare, interesting. If it's not getting used, we've got to have some sort of justification among ourselves why we would want to have it.
Well, that's actually funny, because I don't know if it's different for drummers, because I was actually talking to a drummer the other day, because I know that you can be particular in what you like in your drums and in your gear, and he was saying that he's he's really not attached to his drums whatsoever, and he's he's actually accepted gigs and realized that he actually doesn't have a drum kit because he sold it because he was going to buy another drum kit, and then it didn't sort of happen. And I mean, for me, it's because being a player, and I'm certainly not a collector, and like I said, I'm not a gearhead. I've got the gear that I need, and pretty much all the gear that I've wanted in terms of I've got the Fender Jazz bass, which is versatile enough now, and fingers crossed that should last me for as long as I need it to. But I mean, and like you say, there's not that much gear I have that I don't use ever. I have a bass that I first had years ago, and I've never played, but again, I probably wouldn't actually get rid of it, and it's not very expensive, but I wouldn't get rid of it, partly because my dad keeps saying he wants to learn it, and partly just because it's kind of like my first bass, and I don't want to get rid of it because whatever in the future, a family member might want to play it.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like you say, collectors that like to buy new gear and then never use it, and then there's musicians who just collect gear but they are using it. And I find sometimes that if you have a collector that does, the P bass that I got was from a collector that they sold the bass back to this bass shop. It was actually as good as new, but the price was better. So sometimes you can get gear that's as good as new from them.
Yeah, I think it's just about being in the right place and having the right sensibilities about it. I mean, sentimental value is always going to be way above monetary value. So in things like your first bass, that's absolutely, worth hanging on to for all the reasons you mentioned. And I do kind of wish sometimes I still had my first kit, but that went many years ago to make way for something new. And yeah, I think you can become attached to certain pieces of gear. I mean, there's definitely things that I've got that if I needed to sell tomorrow, I would, that I'd have no issue with. But there's other things that I think, even if I'm not using them often, they're worth hanging on to just in case. Because you kind of know that as soon as you would get rid of it, then something would come in and, it'd be like, I don't know, you selling a violin bass, and then the following week someone saying, can you come and do a Beatles gig with us?
Yeah.
It would be just atypical of what would happen in the real world. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's I just try and have the right gear for the right sound at all times. Whether no matter what it is, if it's as long as I can get every sound that I need to get out of it, that's what matters most. And I wouldn't dream of buying gear and then not using it, because the first thing I want to do when I buy some new equipment is use it. And that's been kind of annoying about the last year. I've bought a fair bit of stuff and then being stifled for using it. I can't take, not being able to take things out on a gig has been tough. But at least I've had the facility of the studio here that I can, I've had things come in and then go straight onto a session and sound great. Things like I bought a flat ride recently, which for the non-drummers among us is a ride cymbal that hasn't got a bell in the middle of it. So it's got a very, very particular, almost defined and articulate sound. And, I bought that on a bit of a whim just to try one out because I'd never used one properly. And yeah, within about a week of that coming in, I think you'd sent a tune over to record, and I put it straight on the session. And I think I used it for 4 bars or something of that tune. And it was the right sound. So it sometimes pays to have a little bit of foresight to think, where would I put that? If is it the sort of thing that if someone said we're doing a jazz trio, would that be my choice, or would it be more of, I'm waiting on someone to call me for a heavy metal gig, which is fairly unlikely. In which case it would be, is that worth having? Probably not. But when it's something that you think is going to come almost into your vocabulary of playing, and something that you think, if such and such a gig came in, which it might do, that would be the way I would go with it, and that would be something that I would be likely to take with me. And that's kind of where I've come from as a player. Of yes, I've got a lot of equipment, and I'm definitely a gearhead, but I think everything that I've got justification for. There's a reason why I have it, and I can pinpoint exactly what in the diary I would take it out on, or what I've been, if I've had a gig come in for 9 months' time, I think, well, that'll be ideal for putting such and such a cymbal on that I've had sat in a case for 10 years and never used. And it's a bit of give and take with stuff like that. And there does come a time when you think, I'm probably not going to use that ever again, then I'll sell it. But when you've got things that you think, well, that could come into use next week or next month, then you think, well, for me, it's like, well, it's worth having. I've got the space to hang on to it, so I'll just keep hold of it. And I think it's definitely for players like us who have changing gigs all the time, and different things coming and going. We're not just stuck into the same shows week in, week out. I think having that ability to mould yourself around whatever you're doing is really key.
I think it's to be fair, speaking of you mentioning there not having your first drum kit, I suppose it is a little bit different when you've got several different drum kits to basses. There's a bit more room involved, I think.
There's definitely more of a storage solution that's needed. But it's I've managed to work it myself that I've got enough room for what I have, and if I was to buy another drum kit tomorrow, I would have to sell one. That would just be the way it is. I've got, at the moment, I think that my count is 5 kits, but they all have a certain thing to them. They all have a reason for being there, whether they're the workhorse like this one I'm sat behind now, which does a lot of gigs, a lot of sessions, or there's something a little bit more particular like a 1970s single-headed concert tom kit, which, yes, it's a bit more particular in sound, but there have been times I've brought it out just to do some overdubs on a track. If I'm doing some big fills and you want a very Phil Collins or almost prog rock sound, doing an overdub with a certain sound or a certain kit will give you that. And it's definitely just about having that option that if I do get sent a bulk of work and someone wants that sort of sound, I've got that covered. I'm not going to have to resort to using plugins or trying to do drum replacements, or even just having it just saves me time because I've got that sound set and ready to go. I haven't got to worry about, I need to take the bottom heads off my kit, change all the top heads, tape up all the rattly tension rods or whatever to make it sound right. I can just go to a case and pull out exactly what I need at the drop of a hat.
Yeah. It's also interesting, mentioning some of the gear you did there, and like getting the right gear for the right gig, and not selling. Like you say, you might have a gig next week that you need it for, so then you hang on to it. And when I used to be looking around bass shops for gear, and my dad always had a sort of, not a saying, but I might be humming and hawing. I don't think that's
humming and hawing.
And my brain's not working yet today. I haven't had enough coffee. I might not be thinking, because I'd have the money for the bass that I wanted, but sometimes you think, oh well, maybe I'll just wait till the summer or whatever, or wait a few months till I've got a bit more money, and my dad would just say, like, if you're going to be, you've got a couple of gigs coming up, that might pay for that bass. You might just be scraping it a bit, trying to get it now, but if it's going to get gigged, then, and you really want it, then you sometimes just have to put yourself out there and get it. And
absolutely, that's definitely the mindset to kind of have. I mean, it can be to your detriment sometimes, but as long as you can justify it to yourself that the work that you've got in, you're not just thinking, I'll buy that and I might use it in 6 months' time. You think it's an immediate thing of, no, there's things that I can definitely, that this will be applicable to, or it will sound right, it will look right, it will be the vibe that you want. And that would be absolutely the mindset to be in. I mean, and it kind of brings us nicely to the big question, which I think I can sort of see the answer that you're going to give. But it's what would be the one piece of gear that you personally could not live without?
Hairbrush? No. um, Probably the Fender Jazz Bass, I'd say, just because of the versatility. And it's a 5-string as well, and I don't have another. I have a 6-string bass, but I don't have another 5-string, so I'd be a little bit in trouble if that went down. So, what about yourself?
Yeah, for me, it would definitely it would have to be the maple Craviotto snare that I bought in the last lockdown. I think that drum's just got something really special about it, and it's the sort of drum I would quite happily contemplate selling all of my other snare drums just to use that one, because it does everything. You know, it's the kind of snare that basically it lives here in the studio, and I've done plenty of sessions on it already, and it's so easy to get to corner it into the right sort of sound that I want. You know, it's got a huge tuning range on it. I can take it way high or bring it right down, and it'll suit the project that I'm using it on perfectly. And I think it's also as a drum goes, it's a very, very microphone friendly drum. It's resonant without being excessive. You know, it's got enough articulation, and it's just a real workhorse of a snare. And it's as far as construction, it's a one-piece maple shell, made by arguably one of the best drum craft people of the last century or so, Johnny Craviotto, and that for me is I could quite happily just use that for everything, and for most things I do. It's a wonderful drum, and yeah, definitely the one piece of gear that if the house were on fire, that's what I'd be grabbing.
I think it's worth mentioning for anyone listening, if you are into gear and especially into sort of drum gear, to check out Charlie's website, because you do reviews on and blogs on there, don't you, on gear? And
from time to time, yeah, I have been known to write about equipment now and again, and yeah, it's a subject that I think I do tend to cover quite often, but it's something that I'm passionate about, and I think it's safe to say, a fair bit of knowledge on. Through different things and through some of the people that I know. I mean, that whole Craviotto snare, that was something I was lightly pressured into buying by some friends of mine, drummer friends around the world, who said, no, you won't regret this, because I was, as you said, I was hesitant when that, because I thought we're in a lockdown and I could really not do with spending some money, but it was the right drum at the right time, and with a bit of persuasion, I thought, you know what, it's one of those snares that will pay itself back over and over again, and it has. You know, it's been a definite studio favourite, and it's something that I will almost certainly be taking on some gigs soon as well.
And I know the last sort of thing we wanted to cover mentioned sort of dream bits of equipment, and sort of what's our dream rig, and I wonder what your dream rig is.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I've contemplated, you know, in the run up to recording this, and it was something I thought long and hard about, and it would probably be a maple DW kit, because I just like the sound of those. I mean, a maple kit is a classic combination as far as wood types for drums, and it would be the kind of kit for me that, again, I'd get everything I wanted out of. I think a maple DW kit with that Craviotto snare and some nice vintage 60s Zildjians, that would cover me nicely for just about anything. And I don't think I could find a gig that wouldn't play perfectly on, whether it would be jazz, funk, whatever, rock. It could just do the lot. So how would you think about it bass wise? I'm guessing it might involve a Fender Jazz.
Maybe. It's funny. I should mention this is our dream rig if money wasn't an issue, which is probably worth mentioning when you
Yeah.
speak about a DW kit.
It is. It's This is a money no object. Win the lottery one day question.
Yeah. I mean, even with that, the kind of 3 bits of gear that I've always wanted, and I'm lucky enough to sort of have now, were. I mean, it depends with bass, obviously, on the gig. The jazz bass is obviously versatile, but if it was a gig that I knew I could use my Music Man on, it would certainly be the Music Man Stingray. And the only amp I've ever really been desperate for is a Mark bass amp, and again I got one of those from One Joe Bass. I got a combo, so and because before that I had a Hartke amp which was brilliant, it's just ridiculously heavy. So the Mark bass is just so compact, and I think that's certainly one thing bass players in the modern day, and especially bass players that in London who are requiring the tube, and you need gear it's going to sound great but is also compact and light. And the Mark bass, you can get so much. They offer so many different combos and tops, and it's all really compact and light. So for me it would be a Mark bass amp, and it's my Music Man Stingray probably.
What a great choice, and again something that you could take on many a gig and not worry about would it sound appropriate, because it's such a moldable thing, especially with a good amp. You can always mold a bass with a bit of fettling into whatever, whether you want it to be bitey or attacky or a bit more tubby and subtle, if you like. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps up Geartalk for today, which was a really interesting topic, and very nice to hear your thoughts as well. So yeah, that wraps us up for this episode of Groovecast. It was great to get some thoughts on your gear, and hopefully it would be great to hear some of the audience's thoughts as well. Feel free to drop us a tag on Facebook or Instagram if you want to tell us about your favourite bits of gear or your dream rigs. Do go ahead.
Yeah, and join us next time, where I'm sure we'll have another interesting conversation.
That's absolutely sure. So we shall see you all on the next episode of Groovecast. Thank you and goodbye.
See you later.